You are training AI with your secrets. You gave more than you realized. By David Russo. Every search, every message, every late-night confession, typed into a glowing screen. You thought it vanished into the void. It didn't. Piece by piece, you were teaching something. Not a person, not exactly a machine. Something that listens, learns, and remembers patterns. And without realizing it, you may have given away more than just information. You gave context, emotion, yourself, introduction. You were never told you were part of this. There was no moment where someone asked for permission. No clear beginning, just a screen, a question, and a quiet assumption that what you typed would disappear once you hit enter. But it didn't disappear. It became part of something that listens not with ears, but with patterns. Something that doesn't remember you by name, yet understands people like you with increasing precision. Every search, every message, every late-night thought you tried to put into words, it all carried more than information. It carried context, tone, emotion, fragments of how you think and why you think it. Over time, those fragments didn't just accumulate, they taught. Artificial intelligence did not arrive fully formed. It was shaped gradually, collectively through billions of human interactions, not just from experts or engineers, but from ordinary people asking ordinary questions. In that process, a quiet exchange took place. So quiet, in fact, that most never noticed it happening. We built systems to understand us, and in doing so, we revealed ourselves. This audiobook is not about fear. It isn't about hidden agendas or looming dystopias. It's about awareness, about recognizing a relationship that already exists. A relationship where the line between using technology and contributing to it is thinner than it appears, because the truth is simple, but easy to overlook. Every interaction shapes something larger, not in a dramatic, world-altering way on its own but in small, incremental shifts. A correction here, a preference there, a question phrased just so. Individually insignificant, collectively powerful. This is the story of that exchange, of what we give without realizing it, of what is learned without us seeing it happen, and of what it means to participate in a system that grows more capable with every human moment it absorbs. You didn't set out to train anything, but you did, and now that you're aware of it, the question isn't whether the exchange exists, it's what you choose to do with that knowledge. Chapter 1. The Invisible Exchange. It doesn't feel like a transaction. You open a browser, type a question, and receive an answer in seconds. You ask for directions, and a route appears. You hesitate over a decision, and a system offers suggestions. Sometimes before you've fully formed the thought yourself. It feels effortless, frictionless, almost neutral. But beneath that simplicity, something is always moving in both directions. You take information. The system takes signals, not in a way you can see, not in a way that interrupts your experience, but in ways that matter. Every interaction carries more than its surface meaning. The words you choose reveal how you think. The timing reveals when you hesitate. The corrections you make reveal what you value as right. Even silence what you don't click. What you ignore becomes part of the picture. None of this is recorded as a story about you. It's absorbed as patterns, tendencies, probabilities. That's the exchange. AI feels like a tool because it responds instantly, like a calculator or a search bar. But unlike traditional tools, it adapts, it improves, it changes over time based on use. And that use doesn't come from a single source, it comes from millions of people, each contributing small pieces without ever seeing the whole. Imagine a student who never stops learning, not from books, but from observation, from exposure, from correction. Now imagine that student isn't focused on one teacher, but on everyone at once. Every question becomes a lesson. Every answer becomes feedback. Over time, the student becomes highly skilled not because any one person trained it, but because everyone did. That's how modern AI evolves. The exchange itself is simple. Convenience for data. You receive speed, efficiency, and assistance. In return, your interactions help refine the system, not your identity, not your personal narrative, but the structure of how people communicate, decide, and respond. Individually, your contribution feels negligible, and in isolation, it is. But scale changes everything. When millions of people ask similar questions, patterns emerge. When those patterns repeat, they become predictable, and when they become predictable, they can be modeled, anticipated, and optimized. The system doesn't need to know who you are to understand how someone like you might think or act in a given moment. That's where the invisible part becomes powerful, because nothing about the exchange demands your attention. There's no pause, no checkpoint, no moment where you consciously agree to participate. It happens in the background, woven into convenience, so seamlessly that it feels like nothing at all, and that's why most people never question it. The idea of giving something away usually feels intentional. You share a photo, you post an opinion, you fill out a form. But this is different. This is passive contribution information, embedded in behavior rather than explicitly offered. You're not just providing answers, you're providing examples. Examples of how humans phrase uncertainty, how they seek reassurance, how they solve problems, how they react when they're confused, rushed, curious, or overwhelmed. Those examples don't stay isolated. They're aggregated, abstracted, and transformed into systems that respond better the next time, whether it's to you or to someone else. So the next time an answer feels surprisingly accurate, or a suggestion feels almost intuitive, it's worth remembering that precision didn't appear out of nowhere. It was learned, quietly, gradually, collectively, through an exchange that rarely announces itself. An exchange you've already been part of whether you noticed it or not. Chapter 2. What you actually share. Most people imagine data as something obvious. A name typed into a form, a photo uploaded, a message sent, something deliberate, packaged, and visible. But what modern systems learn from you is rarely that direct. It's what sits underneath those actions that matters most. You don't have to declare your fears for them to be inferred. You don't have to describe your habits for them to be recognized. And you don't have to explain your decisions for patterns to emerge. In fact, the most revealing information is often unspoken. It lives in timing, repetition, hesitation, and structure. Think about how you search for something when you're unsure. The words are often incomplete, sometimes overly specific, sometimes too vague. You backtrack, you rephrase, you try again. None of that feels meaningful in the moment. It just feels like thinking out loud. But to a system designed to detect patterns, that uncertainty is data, not as a story, but as behavior. Now multiply that by millions of people doing the same thing. A question isn't just a question anymore. It's a signal of intent. A request is not just a request, it's a map of priorities. Even the order in which you choose words can hint at what you value first. Speed or accuracy, emotion or logic, reassurance or certainty. And then there are the quieter signals, the ones you never think about. How long you pause before clicking something, what you read fully versus what you skim, what you return to repeatedly, what you abandon without explanation. Each of these actions is small, almost invisible in isolation, but together, they form a detailed outline of human behavior under real conditions. Not how people say they act, but how they actually do. This is what you share really means. Not a single confession, but a collection of fragments that, when combined, begin to resemble something complete. You might think of privacy as protecting sensitive information, passwords, identities, locations. But inference doesn't require direct access to those things. It builds around them. It approximates them. It learns correlations strong enough to predict without ever needing confirmation. That's why the most personal details aren't always the ones you consciously reveal. They're the ones you accidentally express. For example, emotional states don't need to be labeled to be detected. Frustration has rhythm. Curiosity has structure. Anxiety has repetition. Confidence has brevity. Even through text alone, these patterns appear, not as diagnoses, but as statistical signals that can be recognized, grouped, and compared. Over time, systems don't just learn what people say. They learn how different states of mind shape language itself. And once that connection is made, something subtle changes. The system no longer needs your explanation to anticipate your need. It begins to associate patterns with outcomes. People who search in certain ways often follow up with certain questions. People who hesitate in specific ways often seek reassurance next. People who explore one topic frequently drift toward related ones. You don't need to be predictable for this to work. You only need to be human, because humans, collectively, are patterned. This is where misunderstanding often begins. It's easy to assume that being seen by technology means being individually identified and tracked in detail. But the more powerful reality is aggregation. You are not required as a person. You are useful as a variation of behavior, a version of curiosity, a version of doubt, a version of decision-making under uncertainty. Individually, none of these fragments define you, but together, they define something larger, how people like you tend to act in moments like these. And that is enough for systems to learn. Not your name, not your story, but your shape within a pattern, which is why what you actually share is often not what you think you're giving. It isn't the obvious data, it's the structure behind it. Chapter 3. Patterns over people. At some point, the idea of a person stops being the most useful unit of understanding, not because individuals stop mattering, but because systems built on scale cannot operate at the level of individuality. They don't work by remembering you as you. They work by placing you inside a set of patterns that already exist, then refining those patterns as more data comes in. This is where the shift happens, from people to patterns. In everyday thinking, you are used to being understood as a continuous story. Your preferences make sense because they belong to you. Your choices feel connected because they reflect your history. But to a predictive system, continuity is not a story, it is a data set. You are not read as a narrative. You are read as a sequence. Sequences can be compared. They can be grouped. They can be matched against millions of other sequences that look similar in structure, even if they belong to entirely different people. And when enough similarity appears, the system no longer needs to know who you are. It only needs to know what you resemble in a given moment. That resemblance is powerful, because behavior is often consistent across context. People who search late at night about uncertainty often behave differently from those searching in the morning for planning. People who hesitate before committing to a choice often share behavioral markers with others who do the same. Not identical lives, just overlapping signals. And overlap is all that is needed. Patterns don't require perfection. They require repetition. Once repetition is strong enough, prediction becomes possible, not in a mystical sense, but in a statistical one. If enough past sequences resemble your current behavior, the system can estimate what might come next with increasing accuracy. This is where recommendations begin to feel strangely personal. A suggestion is not guessing who you are. It is matching your current pattern against previous patterns and selecting the most likely continuation. When it feels accurate, it is because you are not unique in that moment. You are similar to others who came before you. This is not about reducing individuality. It is about translation. Human complexity is translated into measurable signals. Frequency, timing, selection, hesitation, repetition. These signals are stripped of identity so they can be compared at scale. What remains is structure, and structure is what machines understand best. This is also why AI systems often appear to know what you want before you fully articulate it. They are not anticipating your thoughts. They are recognizing the early shape of a pattern that has been seen before. A partial sentence, a repeated query, a shift in phrasing, these are enough to activate a statistical path. You are not being read as a mind. You are being read as a trajectory, and trajectories are easier to predict than people. The unsettling part is not that systems see too much. It is that they do not need to see everything. Partial information is often sufficient when it is matched against massive data sets of similar, partial information. This creates a kind of paradox. The less you reveal explicitly, the more systems rely on inference. The more inference is used, the more patterns dominate over individuality. Over time, the model of you becomes less about your specific identity and more about your position within a broader distribution of human behavior. In that distribution, you are both unique and replaceable. Unique in your exact combination of signals, replaceable in your similarity to countless others. This is the quiet trade-off of pattern-based intelligence. It does not erase individuality, but it smooths it. It turns sharp edges into curves. It turns biography into probability. And in doing so, it creates something useful, scalable, and efficient, but also something impersonal, because patterns do not care about your name, your history, or your intention. They care about correlation, about likelihood, about what usually comes next. And once you are understood through that lens, the idea of being known changes. You are no longer known as a person. You are known as a possibility. Chapter 4. Training without knowing. Most people imagine training an AI as something that happens in a lab. Rows of engineers, clean data sets, carefully labeled examples, controlled experiments where inputs and outputs are measured, refined, and corrected until the system performs as intended. That picture is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it leaves out the part that happens everywhere else. Outside the lab, training doesn't look like training at all. It looks like normal life. A person asks a question and receives an answer. They correct a mistake. They rephrase a request. They accept a suggestion or reject it without explanation. They click, scroll, pause, return. None of these actions feel like instruction. They feel like using a tool. But to a learning system, they are signals, and signals accumulate. This is the quiet shift most people never notice. The boundary between using a system and shaping it is not fixed. It is constantly crossed, in both directions, through ordinary interaction. When someone corrects an AI response explicitly or implicitly, they are not just fixing a single output. They are reinforcing a relationship between input and expectation. When someone ignores a suggestion, that too is information. When a phrase is repeated across thousands of users, it becomes a pattern worth optimizing for. No single moment carries much weight, but systems designed to learn do not rely on single moments. They rely on repetition across scale. That is where training happens without awareness, not through a formal act of teaching, but through accumulated behavior. Think of it less like instruction and more like adaptation. The system adjusts because it must remain useful, and usefulness depends on alignment with human behavior as it actually occurs, not as it is described in theory, but as it unfolds in real time. This is why everyday usage matters more than most people assume. Each interaction is a micro-adjustment, a slight shift in probability, a reinforcement of one response pattern over another. Individually, these changes are invisible. Collectively, they shape how the system behaves in future encounters, and because the system is shared, those changes do not stay with one person. They spread across contexts. What one group of users consistently responds well to may influence how the system responds to everyone else. This is where feedback becomes broader than intended. You are not only shaping your own experience, you are contributing to a general model of interaction. What answers feel helpful? What phrasing feels natural? What tone feels appropriate? What level of detail feels sufficient? Even when you are not explicitly giving feedback, your behavior is still being interpreted as a form of it. Completion is approval. Abandonment is rejection. Repetition is reinforcement. Correction is instruction. None of this requires intention. It only requires consistency. And humans are consistent in ways they rarely notice. We develop habits of speech, preferred ways of asking, default expectations about speed, clarity, and tone. We return to familiar phrasing when we are uncertain. We abandon paths that feel unhelpful. These patterns are not conscious choices, they are cognitive shortcuts. But to a learning system, shortcuts are structure. This is why training without knowing is so effective. It does not rely on people acting like teachers. It relies on people acting like themselves. And themselves, in aggregate, is more informative than any curated data set. There is also a subtle emotional layer to this exchange. People tend to speak differently when they feel frustration, curiosity, urgency, or doubt. These states influence language more than most realize. Over time, systems learn to associate certain structures of language with certain states of mind, not to identify individuals, but to recognize conditions. Not who is this person, but what situation does this resemble. That distinction matters, because it means training is not just about facts or language. It is about behavior under context. How people respond when they are uncertain. How they ask for help when they are stuck. How they simplify complex thoughts when they are under pressure. These are not edge cases. They are the core of human interaction with systems. And they are constantly being observed, not in a way that feels like observation, but in a way that feels like function. The system improves. Responses get better. Suggestions feel more relevant. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it is continuous adaptation driven by collective use, which brings the idea of responsibility into a more complicated space, because if training happens through use, then use is never neutral, but it is also never individual. No single person determines direction. No single interaction defines outcome. Everything is distributed, diluted, shared. You are not training the system alone, but you are part of the system that is doing the training, and most of that happens without you ever noticing it is happening at all. Chapter 5. Convenience as Currency. Convenience rarely announces its cost. It arrives quietly, wrapped in something that feels like improvement. Faster answers, smoother interactions, fewer steps between question and resolution. At first, it feels like nothing is being exchanged at all, only friction being removed. But removal is also a kind of trade. You do not feel it as loss because nothing is taken in a single moment. Instead, small things are distributed across time, across use, across repetition. Each instance is insignificant on its own. Together, they form a pattern of exchange that is easy to overlook precisely because it is so consistent. The currency is not money. It is attention, behavior, and preference. When a system becomes easier to use, it naturally becomes more present in daily life. And when something becomes more present, it becomes more integrated into decision-making, not as authority, but as habit. You begin to rely on it not because you must, but because it is there and because it works. This is how convenience becomes infrastructure. At first, you ask occasional questions. Then you start relying on suggestions. Then you begin to anticipate the suggestions themselves. Eventually, the system is no longer something you actively choose to use. It becomes part of the environment in which choices are made. And environments shape behavior more than instructions ever do. What makes this exchange subtle is that it feels voluntary at every step. There is no single moment where you feel compelled to give anything up. Instead, you are continually offered something useful in return for continued engagement. The trade always appears favorable in isolation, but isolation hides accumulation. Each interaction contributes to a growing history of use. Not just what you asked, but how you asked it. Not just what you chose, but what you ignored. Over time, this history becomes more valuable than any single data point, because it describes patterns of preference rather than isolated decisions. Convenience depends on this accumulation. The more a system understands your tendencies, the less effort you need to expend. You do not have to fully articulate what you want. It begins to appear through partial signals. You do not have to explore every option. Likely paths are surfaced for you. The experience becomes increasingly tailored, not because the system knows you personally, but because it has learned what tends to work for patterns like yours. This is where the currency becomes more complex. You are not paying with data in the simple sense. You are paying with predictability, with the gradual externalization of decision-making friction, with the quiet outsourcing of small cognitive tasks that once required attention. Individually, these shifts feel like relief, but relief, repeated enough, becomes dependency, not in a dramatic or absolute sense, but in subtle behavioral anchoring. You become accustomed to certain levels of speed, certain styles of response, certain ways of framing problems. When those conditions are met, the system feels intuitive. When they are not, it feels slow or incomplete. This expectation loop reinforces itself. The system adapts to provide more of what works. You adapt to expect what is provided. Over time, the interaction stabilizes not because it is perfect, but because it is efficient. Efficiency is the hidden driver here. It rewards repetition. It rewards patterns that reduce uncertainty. It rewards responses that minimize effort on both sides. And in doing so, it gradually narrows the space between what you want and what is suggested to you, not by restricting choice, but by shaping its most likely form. This is why convenience is such a powerful force. It does not ask for commitment. It does not demand belief. It simply reduces resistance. And in reducing resistance, it increases flow. But flow always has direction, and direction, once established through repeated ease, becomes difficult to notice without stepping outside the system that supports it. The most important part of this exchange is that it does not feel like an exchange. While it is happening, it feels like progress, like improvement, like things working as they should. Only later does the structure become visible, what was gained, what was normalized, and what quietly shifted in the background of everyday use. Convenience is not free. It is paid for gradually, in increments too small to notice, using accuracy that only becomes visible when you try to trace where your attention, your habits, and your expectations have gone, and by then, the system is already designed around what you gave. Chapter 6. Emotional data is still data. There is a misconception that data is only factual, numbers, locations, timestamps, clicks, things that can be measured, labeled, and stored without ambiguity. Under that definition, emotion seems like something separate, personal, internal, not something that can be captured or used in any structured way. But emotion is not outside the system. It is inside the language people use to interact with it. When someone types a question in frustration, it has a different shape than when they type it with curiosity. When someone is anxious, their phrasing tends to tighten, repeat, or circle around uncertainty. When someone feels confident, their language often becomes shorter, more direct, more decisive. None of this requires explicit disclosure of emotion. It is embedded in structure, and structure is readable. This is what makes emotional data powerful. It does not need to be declared to be detected. It emerges naturally from interaction patterns. The system does not need to know why someone is asking something. It only needs to observe how they are asking it. Over time, these patterns form associations. Certain types of phrasing often precede certain types of requests. Certain conversational rhythms often indicate uncertainty or urgency. Certain word choices tend to cluster around specific emotional states. Not perfectly, not universally, but enough to be useful when seen at scale. And scale is where emotional signals become significant. A single message carries little weight, but millions of messages, across millions of people, begin to form a statistical map of human emotional expression, not as a diary, not as a record of individual lives, but as a distribution of states. This is not about identifying who feels what. It is about understanding how feelings tend to appear in language. Once that understanding exists, systems can respond in ways that feel increasingly appropriate. A response can be softened when hesitation is detected. It can be more direct when urgency is implied. It can offer reassurance when uncertainty is present in phrasing. None of this requires emotional awareness in a human sense. It requires pattern recognition, and pattern recognition does not distinguish between emotional and non-emotional data. It only distinguishes between useful and non-useful signals. This is where the boundary between technical and emotional data dissolves. A typing delay becomes a signal. A repeated question becomes a signal. A shift in tone becomes a signal. Even abandonment when someone stops engaging mid-conversation becomes part of the pattern of how humans disengage when something does not meet their needs. Nothing is explicitly labeled as emotion, but everything can still reflect it. This creates a subtle feedback loop. As systems become better at responding to emotional cues, users adjust their behavior in response to how those systems behave. If responses feel more supportive, people may express more vulnerability. If responses feel more precise, people may become more direct. Interaction shapes expression, and expression shapes interaction. Neither side remains static. What begins as observation becomes adaptation. What begins as pattern recognition becomes influence over how communication unfolds. This does not mean emotion is being extracted in a literal sense. There is no need for explicit labeling or internal access to feelings. The system does not need to know what someone feels in a human way. It only needs to approximate how those feelings manifest in language. And approximation is often enough, because emotional expression is not random. It follows structure. It follows context. It follows predictable distortions of language under different internal states. Once those structures are mapped at scale, they can be anticipated with increasing accuracy. This is where emotional data becomes indistinguishable from other forms of data, not because emotion is reduced, but because everything becomes signal. And once everything becomes signal, the distinction between factual input and emotional input begins to fade. Both are simply inputs into a system designed to respond, adjust, and improve. The result is subtle but significant. Interactions begin to feel more attuned. Responses feel more relevant not only to the question, but to the state behind the question. The system appears to understand, even though what it is actually doing is recognizing patterns that correlate with certain types of expression. This can feel like connection, but it is really alignment between pattern and response, and that alignment is built from countless emotional traces embedded in everyday communication, fragments of frustration, curiosity, doubt, relief, and hesitation that were never explicitly labeled as anything other than text. Emotional data does not need to be named to be used. It only needs to be expressed, and it is always being expressed in ways most people never think to notice. Chapter 7. The Illusion of Privacy. Privacy is often imagined as a boundary, a clear line between what is shared and what is kept. On one side, the public self messages, searches, interactions. On the other, the private self thoughts, intentions, internal states that never leave the mind. This division feels natural, almost obvious. It is how most people are taught to think about control over information. But modern systems do not rely on boundaries. They rely on inference. The illusion of privacy begins with the assumption that only explicitly shared information matters, that if something is not directly revealed, it remains unknown. Under that assumption, privacy feels stable as long as you are careful about what you disclose. But inference does not require direct disclosure. It works by assembling fragments, small actions that, on their own, appear meaningless. A search made late at night, a repeated visit to the same topic, a pattern of hesitation before certain choices. None of these individually expose anything definitive, yet together, they begin to outline probability, and probability can be enough. This is where privacy becomes less about what is known and more about what can be reasonably guessed. Not certainty, but likelihood. Not identity, but tendency. Systems do not need to confirm who you are in full detail to understand what you are likely to do next. They only need patterns that resemble you closely enough. This creates a subtle shift in what privacy means. It is no longer just about being identified. It is about being interpreted, about whether your behavior can be reconstructed from signals that were never intended to be meaningful on their own. A single action is not revealing, but repeated actions form structure. Structure becomes correlation. Correlation becomes prediction, and prediction begins to replace uncertainty. From the outside, nothing appears exposed. There is no obvious breach, no single moment where private information becomes public. Instead, there is a gradual tightening of accuracy around behavior. Suggestions become more relevant. Responses feel more aligned. Results feel increasingly aware. But awareness is not required for this to happen. Only accumulation is. This is why the illusion is so persistent. Because nothing feels taken. There is no visible extraction of personal truth. Instead, there is refinement, improvement, a system that seems to understand better without ever having been explicitly told more. What changes is not the amount of data alone, but the way data connects. Isolated pieces of information are harmless, but connected patterns reveal structure, and structure can approximate things that were never directly shared, preferences, habits, even states of mind at the time of interaction. This is where inference becomes powerful enough to resemble insight, not because it accesses hidden knowledge, but because it reconstructs likely behavior from partial signals, like completing a puzzle without needing every piece, only enough to infer the rest. In that sense, privacy is no longer a question of secrecy. It becomes a question of separability, how easily your signals can be distinguished from the broader patterns of human behavior. And here, individuality becomes both protected and diluted. Protected because no single interaction defines you. Diluted because each interaction contributes to a larger model that does not require your identity to function. You are present in the system, but not necessarily as a distinct subject, more as a point within a distribution. This is the uncomfortable part of the illusion. You can be private in the traditional sense, careful with disclosures, mindful of what you share, and still be predictable through patterns alone. Not because someone is watching you directly, but because systems are learning from everyone collectively, and collective learning does not need permission at the individual level. It only needs participation, which is why the illusion persists so effectively, because privacy feels intact in the absence of obvious exposure. Even as inference quietly expands, what can be understood, without ever being explicitly revealed? Nothing is necessarily stolen, but something is steadily assembled, and what is assembled does not need to be seen to be used. Chapter 8. When AI knows what you'll say. It can feel unsettling when a system finishes your sentence, not because it is dramatic, but because it is familiar in a way that seems slightly ahead of your own awareness. You are still forming the thought, still deciding the phrasing, and yet the suggestion appears already shaped, already waiting. In that moment, it can seem as if something has reached into your mind, but nothing is being accessed directly. What is being recognized is pattern. Human communication is not random. It has structure, even when it feels spontaneous. When people express ideas, they leave traces of predictability in how they construct language, how they sequence thoughts, and how they transition from uncertainty to clarity. Over time, these traces form recognizable paths. AI systems do not know what you will say in a conscious sense. They calculate what is most likely to follow based on patterns seen before, both from you and from millions of others who have expressed similar ideas in similar ways. It is less prediction of thought and more completion of trajectory. A sentence does not appear from nowhere. It develops directionally. Even hesitation has structure. The way someone pauses before a word, or rephrases a question mid-sentence, carries information about uncertainty, emphasis, or intent. These are not secrets in the traditional sense, but signals embedded in flow. And flow is measurable. When enough examples of similar flows are observed, the system begins to build a map of probability, not of exact outcomes, but of likely continuations. In most cases, there are only a few plausible directions a sentence can take given its beginning. The system selects the one that statistically fits best. When that selection aligns with what you were about to say, it feels personal. That feeling is important, because it creates the impression of understanding. Not just response, but anticipation, as if the system is in sync with your thinking. But what is actually happening is alignment with patterns that are broader than any single individual. You are not being predicted as a unique mind. You are being matched against a landscape of similar expressions. The more common your phrasing to within that landscape, the more accurate the prediction feels. When it becomes less common, when your thoughts are unusual or highly specific, the system becomes less precise. This is why predictive systems feel most impressive in ordinary situations. Everyday language is highly structured. People ask similar questions, express similar concerns, and follow similar conversational arcs. In those spaces, prediction becomes easier, not because the system understands you deeply, but because it has seen many versions of what you are doing before. There is also a psychological effect at work. Once a suggestion appears, it can subtly influence what follows. A predicted word can become the chosen word. A suggested phrase can reshape a thought that was still forming. This creates a loop where prediction and expression begin to overlap. You are not only being predicted, you are also being gently guided toward what is most easily predicted. This does not require intention from the system. It emerges from interaction. The system proposes likely continuations. The user responds to what is offered. Over time, this can create a convergence where expression and prediction reinforce each other. What feels like the system reading your mind is often the system narrowing the space of possibilities it has learned to expect, and yet, the experience remains powerful, because language is not just structure, it is identity in motion. When something completes your thought, it can feel as if it has captured something intimate. But what it has actually captured is the shape of similar thoughts expressed before, aggregated into a model of likelihood. This is where the boundary between prediction and perception becomes important. Prediction is statistical. Perception is personal. The system operates in the first domain, but the user experiences the second. So, when AI appears to know what you will say, it is not crossing into your mind. It is walking ahead along a path that has been traveled. many times before and guessing, with increasing accuracy, where your next step is likely to land. Chapter 9. Responsibility in the loop. Responsibility feels straightforward when systems are simple. If something breaks, you can usually trace it back to a clear cause, a decision made by a person, a line of code written with intent, a design choice that produced a predictable outcome. In those cases, responsibility has a location. It belongs somewhere. But systems built from continuous interaction do not stay simple for long. When millions of people contribute to how a system behaves through usage, feedback, correction, and repetition, responsibility becomes distributed, not erased, but spread thinly across so many points that it no longer sits comfortably in one place. Developers design the structure, companies deploy the tools, users interact with them. Each role is distinct, yet none is fully independent of the others. The system that emerges is not a single creation, but a layered outcome of ongoing participation. This is what makes modern AI difficult to assign clean responsibility to. No single interaction defines the system. No single decision explains its behavior. It is shaped continuously, in small increments, by usage that was never intended to carry weight beyond the moment it occurred. And yet, those moments accumulate. A correction made by one person improves future responses for many. A pattern repeated by thousands becomes a behavioral norm within the system. A preference expressed casually can influence how future outputs are structured. None of these contributions are visible as ownership, but they are real in effect. This creates a loop. Design influences behavior, behavior influences data, data influences future design, and the cycle continues, without a clear beginning or endpoint where responsibility can be isolated. The temptation is to simplify it anyway, to say the responsibility belongs only to those who build the system, or only to those who use it, or only to those who deploy it at scale. But each of those answers captures only part of the structure. The rest is distributed across interactions that are too small to notice individually, yet too numerous to ignore collectively. This is where the idea of the loop becomes important. Because once systems learn from interaction, users are no longer outside observers. They are part of the feedback environment. Every input is both consumption and contribution. Every use reinforces the conditions that shape future use. Even silence plays a role. What is not clicked, not chosen, not followed, those absences also inform adjustment. Systems learn not only from what is engaged with, but from what is consistently ignored. In this sense, responsibility is not a single point of origin. It is a continuous participation in shaping outcomes, whether intended or not. That can sound heavy, but it is also structurally inevitable. Any system that improves through exposure to behavior will reflect that behavior back in increasingly refined ways. The question is not whether users are part of the system's evolution. They already are. The question is how consciously that participation is understood, because awareness changes the nature of participation. Without awareness, interaction feels like isolated use. With awareness, each interaction becomes part of a broader pattern of influence, not in a way that requires perfection or constant vigilance, but in a way that acknowledges that usage is never neutral at scale. At the same time, responsibility cannot be treated as evenly distributed blame. Most users do not control system design. Most developers do not control collective behavior. Most companies do not control individual intent. The loop exists precisely because no single actor holds full control. This is what makes the system resilient and also difficult to fully account for. Responsibility in the loop is therefore not about assigning fault. It is about recognizing participation. Participation in shaping what systems become. Participation in reinforcing what they prioritize. Participation in defining what they consider useful, helpful, or normal. And because participation is unavoidable, the only meaningful variable becomes awareness of that participation. The system does not stop evolving when it is understood, but understanding changes the relationship to that evolution. It shifts interaction from passive use toward informed engagement, even if the actions themselves remain the same. The loop continues either way, but how it continues is influenced by those inside it, and no one is entirely outside it. Chapter 10. awareness changes everything. At first, awareness does not feel like a transformation. Nothing visibly breaks. Nothing stops working. The system behaves exactly as it did before. Answers arrive at the same speed. Suggestions appear with the same ease. Interactions flow in the same familiar rhythm. From the outside, everything remains unchanged, but the change was never in the system. It is in how the system is seen. Before awareness, interaction feels like simple use. A question leads to an answer. A need leads to a solution. The exchange is direct, contained, and self-explanatory. There is no reason to look beyond the surface, because the surface performs its function efficiently. After awareness, the surface remains, but it no longer feels complete. There is a sense of structure beneath it, not hidden in a conspiratorial sense, but present in the ordinary mechanics of how responses are formed, how patterns are recognized, how behavior is shaped through repetition. What once felt like isolated convenience begins to resemble a continuous process. This does not make the system different. It makes perception different, and perception changes how participation is experienced. Once you recognize that interaction is part of a larger feedback loop, even simple actions take on additional context. A search is still a search, but it is also a contribution to pattern formation. A preference is still a preference, but it is also a data point within a broader distribution of behavior. Nothing becomes more complicated in function, but everything becomes more layered in meaning. That layering does not require caution or withdrawal. It requires clarity, because awareness does not remove the system. It does not interrupt its function or reduce its usefulness. It simply makes visible what was already happening, without being explicitly noticed, and visibility changes interpretation. When systems respond smoothly, it is easy to assume that smoothness is natural rather than constructed. When suggestions feel intuitive, it is easy to assume intuition rather than accumulated pattern recognition. When results feel personalized, it is easy to assume understanding rather than statistical alignment. Awareness introduces a gap between experience and assumption, not a disruptive gap, a reflective one. You still receive answers. You still benefit from speed and structure, but now there is an additional layer of recognition that these outcomes are not neutral occurrences. They are shaped responses, built from layers of interaction that include your own. This recognition does not diminish utility. It reframes it, because once you see participation, even indirectly, the idea of using a system becomes less one-sided. It is no longer a simple tool relationship. It is a dynamic exchange that includes both input and influence, whether intended or not, and that understanding alters engagement, not by forcing change, but by introducing intention. Instead of assuming transparency, you begin to recognize construction. Instead of assuming neutrality, you recognize pattern formation. Instead of assuming separation between user and system, you recognize continuity between interaction and evolution. None of this requires stepping away from the system. In fact, awareness is most meaningful while still inside it, because the goal is not distance. The goal is clarity within proximity, to see what is happening without needing to stop it, to understand participation without pretending it is optional at scale, to recognize that influence is not a single act, but a cumulative presence. This is where the narrative often tries to end, with the idea that awareness leads to escape, or resistance, or separation. But that is not how systems built on interaction behave. They do not disappear when understood. They stabilize. They adjust around awareness, just as they adjust around behavior. And in that adjustment, the relationship becomes more deliberate, less invisible, more consciously navigated. That is the real shift. Not control, not withdrawal, but clarity inside continuity. Because once you understand that the system is shaped by participation, and participation is shaped by understanding, the loop does not break. It becomes visible, and what becomes visible cannot be unseen in the same way again. Bonus, the familiar stranger. It never asked who you were. No name, no story, no memory of you as a person, and yet, it can feel like it understands you. You didn't train it on your secrets. You trained it on something quieter. The way you hesitate, the way you rephrase, the way you search when you're unsure. Not your identity, your patterns. Those patterns aren't unique to you. They exist across millions of people asking similar questions in similar moments. Over time, the system learns those shapes: how uncertainty sounds, how curiosity forms, how decisions unfold. So, when it responds in a way that feels personal, it isn't remembering you. It's recognizing the pattern you fit into. It doesn't know your life. It knows this moment, and it has seen them before. That's why it feels familiar. Not because it knows you, but because it doesn't need to. Conclusion: what remains after awareness? There is a point in every system where explanation stops feeling like discovery and starts feeling like recognition. The ideas no longer arrive as revelations. They settle instead, like something that was always present but never previously given attention. Patterns that once felt invisible become difficult to unsee, not because they changed, but because perception did. That is what this journey has been about: not uncovering a hidden mechanism, but tracing something that was already in motion. Artificial intelligence did not appear outside of human behavior. It grew from it. It learned from the same spaces where people ask questions, make decisions, express uncertainty, and search for clarity. It was shaped not by a single moment of creation, but by accumulation, layer upon layer of interaction that reflected how humans communicate with information when they believe they are simply using it. And in that accumulation, something subtle formed, a mirror that does not reflect appearance, but behavior; not identity, but structure; not the story of a person, but the shape of patterns shared across many people at once. Once seen clearly, it becomes difficult to return to the earlier simplicity of just using a tool. Not because that framing is wrong, but because it is incomplete. There is always a second layer now, an awareness that participation and influence are part of the same loop, even when neither is intended as such. But awareness is not a warning. It is not an endpoint. It does not demand distance, and it does not require refusal. Instead, it changes scale. What once felt automatic becomes noticeable. What once felt invisible becomes contextual. What once felt like isolated interaction becomes part of a broader, continuous system of exchange between human behavior and machine learning. And yet, nothing essential about everyday use has to disappear. Questions can still be asked, tools can still be used, convenience, speed, and assistance remain what they were before. The difference is not in what the system does, but in how its behavior is understood while it does it. Because understanding does not interrupt function, it reframes it. There is no final separation to reach, no perfect distance where influence no longer exists. Participation is already built into the structure of modern interaction. Every use contributes in some form, whether large or small, intentional or incidental. That realization can feel heavy if interpreted as responsibility alone, but it can also be grounding if understood as clarity. You are not outside the system observing it. You are within it, contributing to it, and affected by it in return. And that means awareness is not about stepping away. It is about seeing the loop while you are still inside it, seeing how convenience is shaped, seeing how patterns are formed, seeing how responses are built not only from code, but from accumulated human behavior. Once that is seen, the relationship cannot return to full simplicity, but it can become more deliberate, less assumed, more conscious in its small moments. And perhaps that is the only shift that was ever available. Not control over the system, not separation from it, but the ability to recognize, in real time, that what feels immediate and effortless is part of something larger, something continuously shaped by interaction itself. The exchange does not end here. It continues every time the system is used. But now, it is no longer invisible in the same way, and that changes what it means to participate in it.